Hey guys, my name is Deb Marnie and I'm from Aussie Maille. This is our chain mail tutorial channel. Hey guys, big hi, hello, welcome, how are you? Thanks for popping in and seeing me today. It's great to see you. So today I've got a weave tutorial for you. This weave is called A6 and it's a Byzantine helm variant. Alright guys, let's get straight into it. Okay guys, so I've made up some sample pieces for you of the A6 weave. So coming up here on the side of the screen will be some of the ring sizes I've used for these pieces, and I'll also list some of them down in the description box below. But to just discuss these with you. Now, this weave, I should say, I found the aspect ratio of about 7.1 for the larger rings and about 4.8 for the smaller rings was the ideal aspect ratio. Now there is a little play in the rings. You can change that up a little bit, but not too much. So I've got a couple of different versions of some of the gauges. Our 14 gauge version, I've got two sizes here. So the plain silver one, the large rings, so these ones that you can see here that form sort of the helm part of this, those ones are 14 gauge AWG, 1.6 millimeter wire with a ring ID of 7/16 of an inch or 11.11. Now this is a little bit larger than ideal. I would say perhaps 11 millimeters would be a better size. I just didn't have access to 11 millimeters at the time that I made this video, so I substituted the 7/16. So these have an actual aspect ratio of about 7.38, 7.4. As I said, I found about 7.1, 7.2 to be a better aspect ratio. But 7/16 work. Now the smaller rings on here are also 14 gauge AWG, 1.6 millimeter diameter wire with a ring ID of 7.5 millimeters. So I would consider this an ideal size for these middle rings. This one here, again, I chose the bigger rings are again the 7/16, and because I had a little bit of play with them, I went with a slightly larger middle ring. So these ones are 14 gauge AWG, 1.6 millimeter. They're 5/16 of an inch or 7.94 millimeters. So even though they're a little bit bigger, these ones are 7.5, these ones are 7.9. It still works within the large ring. So you're looking for a ring that fits, the smaller ring needs to fit inside the larger ring, just inside the larger ring, and it'll still work. If it's any bigger than the larger ring, it's not going to work, guys. If it's too much smaller than the larger ring, it also will not work. But there is a little bit of play in there for you. So the 16 gauge version, now this one I would consider ideal, okay? So this is 16 gauge AWG, 1.2 millimeter diameter wire, a ring ID of 8 millimeters for the large rings, and a ring ID of 7/32 of an inch, which is 5.56 millimeters. They have a ring ID of an aspect ratio of 7.17 for the large rings and 4.83 for the smaller rings. So again, that is what I would consider ideal. It makes a very, very nice bracelet, gives you fantastic definition to the weave. Alright, so here I've got my two 18 gauge AWG versions. The silver one is what I would consider perhaps more slightly ideal in size. So it's 18 gauge AWG, 1 millimeter diameter wire. The large ring for this one is 6.5 millimeter ID and the small ring is 4.5 millimeter. So that gives you aspect ratios of 7.1 and 4.8. This version here is slightly different. The ring size, the large ones are still 6.5 millimeters, but the colored rings and the smaller rings here, they're 3/16 of an inch or 4.76 millimeters. So they've actually got an aspect ratio of 5. So although they're a slightly bit bigger than the other one, they do work. I just find it gives it a little looser looking weave. But if you want to incorporate colour into it, and I think it does look fabulous with just a smidgen of colour incorporated into it, then you can definitely go with the 3/16 rather than the 4.5 millimeters. Now I didn't get a 20 gauge version made up for you guys, but in theory you'd be looking at 20 gauge AWG which is 0.8 millimeter, and in theory, remembering I haven't tested these, the large outer ring would be 5.25 millimeters, and the smaller ring you'd be looking at about 9/64 or 3.57 millimeters. Now, as I said, I haven't tested those ring sizes. They're just working on the other aspect ratios that I found successful with these pieces. Okay, so I'm going to be working in the 14 gauge AWG rings today, so 1.6 millimeter wire. I'm starting off with the small rings, the 5/16 of an inch. I'm opening up one of my silver rings. Now, I'm going to work in this colorway. I'm going to demonstrate this colorway today, where the colored rings are just within the large rings, so the helm section of the weave. You can, of course, do color all the way down. You can do bright aluminium all the way down. I found doing color in all the little rings, it really changed the look of the weave. It drew your attention to that center line and almost made the larger rings disappear, which I felt changed the look of the weave or the feel of the weave for me, which is why I then broke up the color and just popped little bits of color in the middle. Gives it a nice little bit of interest without it overwhelming the weave. But guys, the choice is yours. So working in that colorway today, I'm going to start with the bright aluminium ring. I'm going to pop on 2 of my coloured rings. Now those rings have already been closed. Close that one up and feed a second bright aluminium ring through the AA. So I've got my short piece of 2. I'm then going to take up a twist tie and I'm going to pop that through my silver rings. And I'm going to very loosely tie that. Now I don't want that tight around the actual rings themselves. I want to give the rings the ability to move a little bit in there. So just tie it on there loosely just to help keep things stable but not lock them down too tight. Then taking up your large ring, so in this case 14 gauge AWG 7/16 of an inch. I'm going to start this section like I would helm. So I'm going to go in between my 2 silver rings. I don't actually go through any rings with this one. I take it in between my 2 silver rings, bring it out the other side so that it encircles my coloured ring. And I lock that in place, or I close that up, I should say. Okay. So your work should look like this. So you can see that ring has just gone in between, it hasn't gone through anything. And we're going to double that ring. We're going to place a second large ring through the same path. And lock that in place. Okay. So we've got our work looking like this at the moment. We want to take up one of our small rings in the silver and we're going to feed that through one side of our small rings there, the coloured small rings. Close that up, flip our work over to the other side and place one on the other side of our weave, going through just the smaller rings. Okay, and your work should look like this. Okay, so we've got our helm looking piece there. Then taking another one of our silver rings, we're going to lock these 2 small rings that we just placed. So what we want to do is we're going to feed this ring straight through this intersection point here, making sure we pick up all 4 rings. So we pick up both of the 2 small rings and the 2 large rings that are in place. Okay, things are a little bit loose, but it will all lock into place for you. So just feed that through. Sorry about that. Try that one again. So just feed that through all 4 of your rings there. Make sure you pick all 4 up. Close it up. and we want to place one on the other side of our weave as well. So again, one of your small rings in the silver, go through all 4 of those rings there, your 2 small rings and the 2 large rings, close it up. Okay, so your work should look like this. Next, take up one of your small coloured rings and feed that through the last 2 rings that you placed. Double that ring up. Okay. So your work is looking like this at the moment. Now our next ring that we place is a large ring, and this ring is going to go, we're looking at our work here, it's going to slip in between our 2 silver rings here. So we've placed 3 sets of small rings. We're going to slip this through the second set, between the second set, through the first set, so it comes out the other side, and it then encircles our 3rd set of small rings. So just to repeat that, slips, we've got 3 sets of small rings that we've placed. Our large ring slips in between the second set, through the first set, so through that space in there, doesn't pick up the large ring, we're just picking up the small rings, goes straight through there, out the other side, and it will then encircle our 3rd set of small rings. So to show you what that looks like with a ring, slipping it in between the second set, through the middle of the first set, so you can see that going through and picking up all those rings, coming out so that it actually encircles the colour pair. It doesn't go through the coloured pair at all, it just encircles them. Now, one thing to note, you can see here that the coloured rings have slipped out. I've got one in the middle, one on the outside of our middle pair of silver rings. Try and keep those in the middle, guys. You need them to be in the middle of the second pair, okay? They will move around a little bit, so just keep an eye on them before you put this second ring into place. So another second ring, so a second large ring through the same path, okay, encircling our coloured rings. Okay, so your work should look like this. Oh, close that up a bit better. Okay, so this is the first large pair of rings that we placed. This is the second large pair of rings that we placed. So holding your work like this, so that the large rings that we placed are facing towards us, we take up a small silver ring, feed it through one side of our weave through the coloured rings in the centre there, close that up, flip our work over to the other side. Now because these rings aren't quite ideal, it is a little bit loose, guys. The rings can move a little bit out of position, so just be gentle with them and move them around before you lock everything into place. So there's our first pair of small rings placed. Okay, we then want to lock them into place. Again, you can see this has slipped out, so we just feed that through there, making sure we've got it. It does become stable once you've locked everything in place. It's just a little unstable as you're weaving it. So you just need to keep an eye and make sure nothing's moved out of place. So there's our first pair of our small rings placed in weave. Taking another small silver ring, we're going to lock those previous small rings in place by going through our 2 small rings and our 2 large rings on one side of the coloured rings that are already in weave. Okay, close it up, pop one on the other side of your work, making sure you pick up all 4 rings. Okay, there's our second set of small rings placed. Our final set of small rings are our coloured rings, and we put those through the rings that we just placed. So there's 1, there's 2. Okay, so we've placed 3 sets of small rings. Our next ring is a large ring. So open that up. Remember, we want this to slip in between the second pair of rings, picking up the first pair of rings and circling the third pair of rings. It's much easier than it sounds. Okay, so just slip in between here, picking up our second pair of rings there. Okay, so we've slipped between the second pair, we've gone through and picked up the first pair of rings. We're encircling the third pair of rings. Close that up and place a second large ring through the same path. Okay, just making sure that your coloured rings are staying in position. You want them in between the previous silver pair. You don't want them outside. So just make sure that they're in position before you feed your next large ring. Okay, so between the second pair between the second pair goes through the first pair of rings. So here are the first pair of rings here, and you can see our large ring down in there. We've scooped them up and we've come up around the third pair of rings, and we close it. And that's pretty much it, guys. That's all you need to do to complete the A6 weave. So I'll just run through it once more. So small silver, pick up our last set of small coloured rings in our weave. So we're finishing up the helm section here. 1 on each side of our weave, going through the small rings. Okay, once we've got those in place, we want to lock those 2 rings down. So we take up another silver ring. We're going to feed that through both of our small rings and both of our large rings. So our most recent small rings and our large rings. 1 on that side of your coloured rings, 1 on the other side. So this is our second set of small rings put in place. Okay, we've got 1 and 2. Our final set of small rings is our coloured rings. And we just put those through the most recent pair of silver rings that we have placed. Okay, so there's our 3 sets of rings, guys. 1 silver, 2 silver, 3 coloured. We then want to take up one of our large rings. Looking at our work like this, we want to slip this one in between our second pair of rings, picking up our first pair of rings as we passed through and encircling our third pair of small rings. So slipping in between our second pair, picking up the first pair. Okay, make sure you've got that both of those first pair of rings, and it just then encircles our third. Close it up and feed another ring through the same path. Making sure before you do that our coloured rings
Our third set here is sitting inside of our second set. We don't want them on the outside of that set. And we feed it through the same path. Okay, in between the second, picking up the first and encircling the third. Close it up. And it's just rinse and repeat until you reach the length that you require. But that's it, guys. That's all you need to know to complete the A6 weave. Alright, my lovelies, well that is it. That is the video tutorial for today. I hope you enjoyed it and you found it useful. If you did find it useful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up here on YouTube. Share the video if you like. If you're not a subscriber, if you would consider doing that for us, that would be awesome. Check out some of the other content while you're here. Comments or questions down below the video. We will do our best to get back to you as soon as we can. And last but not least, guys, don't forget to give our shop link up here in the corner a little bit of love and affection. That's where we sell the bits and bobs and what's my jigs you're going to need to whip up this weave and many others. Alright guys, thanks once again for popping in and seeing me. It's great to spend time with you again. Keep safe, keep well, and I will see you again sometime in the very near future. Bye.